event. We just got word the minister should be here in 9 or 10 minutes, and we ask your understanding. Obviously, there's coffee in back, there's restrooms out there, and we will start as soon as the minister gets here. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, both our in-person audience and our global audience tuning in live over the web. We are grateful to the Embassy of India and the Finance Ministry of India for bringing us together on this most auspicious occasion for some very important, I hope, discussion, certainly from our guest. We are very privileged today to be hosting Nirmala Sitharaman, India's finance minister. She is going to be speaking or discussing the resilience of and the growth of the Indian economy, which of course has been quite noteworthy in recent years, not just in absolute terms, but in a world where the Fed and the ECB are tightening policy, raising interest rates, and a world where energy and food came into price shocks. India has continued to move forward, and this is quite an accomplishment. Ms. Sitharaman, my apologies, was appointed as India's Minister of Finance and Corporate Affairs in 2019. She was first elected to the Rajya Sabha in the Parliament of India in 2014 and subsequently re-elected in 2016. She has also held several ministerial portfolios since 2014, including Minister of Defense, Minister of State of the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Minister of State in the Ministry of Finance, and Minister of State in the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. Again, as Finance Minister, she oversees those last two ministries now. She has been a member of the BJP party since 2006 and previously served as a spokesperson for the party. Ms. Sitharaman, I apologize, obtained a master's degree in economics and an MPhil from Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi and a Bachelor of Arts degree in economics at the Sita Lakshmi Ramaswamy College in Tiruchirappalli. More pressingly, for those of us in Washington, she has been a powerful figure in her views and in her vision at the G20, including with India's leadership of the G20 in recent months, and we're very privileged to have her with us here today at the Peterson Institute. Thank you, Minister. Minister, you generously suggested we have a chat, which I will try to make the best use of. This is a privilege for us. Let me start with the biggest question, in a sense, which is, to what do you ascribe the resilience of the Indian economy coming through this cycle of COVID, energy shocks, interest rate hikes? That has not always been the case when India has faced such circumstances in the past.
Well, it is definitely the resilience of the people, the enterprising nature of Indian people, and to be able to take it upon themselves that despite all the suffering, um, sacrifices, in fact, many of them lost their near and dear ones during the pandemic. Um, Despite all that, if the Indian people saw an opportunity that they can take this challenge up and come out in their businesses, despite, as I said, the tragedies at home, helping each other. Community service was one of the best feature, I would think, during that time. No one hesitated to help the neighbor with medicines or food if they were quarantined. And the government, of course, extended the assistance for humanitarian considerations and for reviving the economy, coming up with schemes which benefit targeted audience. So government's policy played to the spirit of wanting to come out by the people of India, and that I would put in essence was the reason behind this revival and a sustained growth.
And going forward, putting it in more crude macroeconomic terms, what do you think has happened to the trend growth rate of the Indian economy? It's one thing for people to come together, as you describe, in a time of crisis. Do you think this will have continuing benefits going forward for India?
Yes, most certainly, because we've seen even in the troubled times, just as we were coming out, recovering, and then you also had the support of the extensive campaign on vaccination. Both India-made vaccine and also India-produced vaccine, uh, getting door delivered, attending to those with comorbidities, and also making sure that the frontline workers were given the assistance when they had to be given priority. So with all this, you could see that the support of the government was there at every step. So even as the challenge was still on, you saw the people showing that kind of a capacity to ensure that the economic activity was happening first for their families and then contributing to the economy, larger economy itself. So if it could happen, even when the vaccinations were still ongoing, now that the process is complete, booster shots have been given, and we are better readied for meeting another, God forbid, contingency, such similar contingency. I don't see the spirit with which recovery had happened waning out. On the contrary, I would see that Indians have seen that exports going up, um, finding newer markets where recession has hit some markets which are traditionally our markets during, in some sectors, for instance, textiles, apparels, used to go to a certain market, let's say Europe, no longer a very prosperous market because of the foreboding of a recession. But our textile industry are finding newer markets and so on. So even during the pandemic, just as we were coming out of it, our agricultural products found markets outside. So the spirit with which you're saying this as an opportunity sustains even today, even as the global recession is being very clearly documentized, if I can use it.
Yes.
So the Indian opportunity that is before every businessman, every trader, every exporter, every manufacturer is there for everyone to seize the opportunity. And that spirit prevails. And that's why I think this growth is sustainable. This desire to want to expand is sustainable. And that itself will further trigger growth.
There are so many topics for which India in itself is, of course, important in its own terms, but also the ideas you're talking about. Let me start down one of them, which is the openness of the world economy. You've talked about export growth and opportunities being grabbed by your entrepreneurs. There is a lot of discussion in Washington and elsewhere about efforts at deglobalization, US disengagement from China, stalling at the WTO, and so on. How do you see the picture for Indian business in the global markets? Are you concerned about the trading system, or do you think that that's overblown? How do you see this set of opportunities? Are they closing or opening?
There are two ways of looking at it if you're sitting in India and watching how this is playing out. First, I think for a very long time, India's attempts to make sure our manufacturing sector grows, we have a big play. We also don't import final consumer goods, which we are capable of manufacturing. However, when you have price discrepancies or price competitiveness affecting your purchasing decisions, you end up buying those which you can produce because they come at a far more cheaper rate. So Indians have always had this difficulty in having to come back to producing certain things which are your day-to-day domestic necessities, but you're unable to produce because you find cheaper imports coming of the very same requirement. But now we've seen that there is an opportunity which lies. One, from the consumer point of view, that even within India there's enough purchasing power, and many of these goods which can be produced in India will have a definitive large consumer base within the country. So catering to the domestic market itself has become now attractive for many of those producers who wouldn't have produced such things which were otherwise available for cheap from outside. Two, the phased manufacturing programs that we have come up with have identified several such goods, which at the first stage we would gradually incentivize producing and selling within India, then move over to a higher level of sophistication in the making of such goods. So the domestic market itself is available for you to produce, gradually stop imports of such things which you can produce yourselves. Whilst this is one side of the story, the other side is where you need to have value chains come to India, come and produce in India, not just for India, but to export from India, for which again we have come up with a production-linked incentive schemes, particularly in 13 such areas which are priority sectors, sunrise sectors, where India didn't produce at all earlier. By doing that, we hope to have production of many of these large bulk manufactured goods which can go from India abroad to meet demands which exist outside, and also of course to meet domestic. The mobile manufacturing is a classic example. The PLI helped it. India's mobile manufacturing capacity in 2014 was almost nil. It didn't exist at all. Between 2014 and today, we are one of the second largest exporters of manufactured telephones, mobile phones, not telephones.
Right.
So you're able to see that production-linked incentive schemes for 13 such sectors, inclusive of semiconductors, are bringing in global value chains into India, not just for manufacturing for India, but largely for exporting as well. On the other hand, you have incentivized production through a phased incentivized program, so that goods which are largely consumed in India are going to be manufactured in India, despite a very, very predatory pricing which prevails in some export countries, in some export markets. So we are stopping that by giving the phased manufacturing, and we are incentivizing through the PLI.
You have spoken in the past, and obviously it's a signal policy of yours, about the phased manufacturing program. Do you see any tension between India pursuing that program and the potential for backlash of others pursuing similar programs, or is it that this is a leveling of the playing field, or is it just India's big and should act like a big player? I mean, how does this play out if Brazil and Russia and US all go to rules of domestic content?
I don't think there's a one point answer for this. It's going to have to be calibrated to include all these challenges, even as you want to incentivize India's own production. There can always be some collateral, but it has to be very smartly tailored to make sure that India's unique demands can be met by your own manufacturing. But at the same time, you need to get your raw materials and intermediaries, which otherwise you do not have. So it's not as if you're going to be so blindfolded to see that you'll just take a decision and it will have no impact whatsoever outside. It can't be so. It will have impact. We'll have to assess each for itself and take a call. But however, I don't think India is alone in doing this, particularly after, let's say, the global view of China, after, let's say, the pandemic, after also this changing perspective of what indeed is globalization, how far globalization, to what extent globalization. So when all these questions are happening and being discussed all over the world, India cannot be in isolation. So if that's going to, the discussions elsewhere are going to have some impact, so will we have in India as well. So it indicates to a dynamic position globally on globalization itself, and also looking at how just tariff is not going to be one way of controlling or preserving your capacities in manufacturing. So it is a strand, I suppose, in a larger debate of how the global trade will have to happen.
Thank you for the nuance. So in that regard, obviously there are a number of plurilateral trade agreements being negotiated. India's been part of some of those and not of others. The WTO multilateral agenda seems to be quite stalled. In your role, speaking for India on such issues, where do you see any prospect for multilateral rounds being useful? In addition, with RCEP and CPTPP and areas adjoining yours, are there agreements that India wishes to pursue at this time in terms of trade? Or is it, we'll take it as it comes and negotiate?
No, I think India has shown very clearly its initiative is working out well in pursuing with countries and agreeing to have FTAs with them. So free trade agreements are being signed, in fact, far speedily nowadays. We've just concluded one with Australia. We've concluded earlier one with the UAE, Mauritius. And as it is, we've had agreements with ASEAN, free trade agreements both in goods and services with ASEAN. We have had with Korea, with Japan. So free trade agreements have bilaterally or with multilateral groups been the route which India has had till before 2014, and now between 2019 and today, we've had at least 3 major agreements signed. So we shall proceed in that route also with the United Kingdom, with the European Union, and with Canada. All the 3 are happening now. As we speak, the negotiations are going on. So we shall go in those preferential routes. Plurilateral, I'm not sure where it's going to begin, when it's going to begin. I know between 2014 and 16, there was a lot of, what can I say, ferocious speed with which the TPP was pushed forward. It had its own course, a roller coaster course. But now I think there is an attempt to revive it. We'll see when that comes. But we are very clearly moving forward on bilateral agreements, preferential agreements with some countries.
I'm sorry to push further, but on the multilateral front, is there anything you would like to see agreed at the WTO or not really?
Well, I would love WTO to be a lot more progressive, a lot more listening to all countries, to be fair to all members. I fortunately or unfortunately spent some time with the WTO in my capacity as a Commerce Minister of India between 2014 and 17. No, it has to give more space to hear voices of countries which have something different to say. And not just hear, but also somewhat heed. Because today's message for the WTO should be to have greater openness. In fact, I'm not quoting in the context of WTO, but it might be useful to recall the words of US Commerce Secretary Catherine Tai. She had recently spoken, and I was very, very impressed, if I can use that word, about what exactly is the traditional trading approach. What exactly is liberalizing the market? What would actually mean in terms of tariff reduction? It is true now, countries do look at it. It is a time when countries are looking at what extent to which you would want to have market liberalization. It has had cost repercussions for the US economy. And that's exactly what the US Secretary of Commerce has said. And if that's something which the United States Commerce Secretary feels, I felt the same in 14 and 15. Probably my articulation was never getting a space in global media. But many of the global South countries do have the same feeling. What exactly is this? How far is liberalization? To what extent tariff reduction? We in India, for all the less developed countries, I won't take too much of
No,
time
no, no.
on this one issue.
I'm just looking at my notes. Please
this
take as
one
long as you want.
All right. The global South, if you would ask them, would have similar opinion as today's Commerce Secretary. But in India, we've already extended to all the least developed countries quota-free, tariff-free trading policy. So any country, let's say from Africa or anywhere else, the Pacific Islands or countries which are aspirational low-income countries, can export to India without any of these restrictions. So where it is possible, we are opening up. But at the same time, we need to look at how India has become demanufactured almost, because if you go through the MFN route, you end up opening up for the efficient ones in the market, and that may not be your country. Manufacturing abilities of communities have all gone for a toss, not just in India, but I suppose in many countries as well. How do you get your manufacturing back if only you have to constantly liberate your market and say tariff reduction? Discussion-worthy points.
Yeah, yeah. And so it's interesting because there are some of us who are worried that one of the reasons Ambassador Tai's policies may be dangerous is not so much even what it means for the US, but that it may exclude the possibility of the global South, of developing countries, ever getting access to American markets. I mean, I guess this all has to be weighed, but
absolutely,
it's very striking to hear you in your position and India's position to be saying what you're saying.
Because our attempt to talk to the WTO, talk in WTO, yes, have all faced with just no movement. Mm-hmm. The other classic example, which is in the minds of many of the emerging market countries, is the electronics and yes, the electronic transmission related wall which exists.
That's in my notes. Yes, please.
Right. Isn't it since 1998, all of us are sitting and watching that you can't do anything on the customs route for so much that is happening in the electronics business. It's hitting the kind of countries very differently. Since 1998, there's never been a need for reviewing it. All that I'm asking is that. And why wouldn't every ministerial conference which happens, MC1, MC12, MC10, whatever, ever take up this for discussion? It doesn't take. Mandatorily, the moratorium continues. So it shouldn't be difficult for you to appreciate. I go back to your observation. So when countries will have to speak at the WTO, it has to be on very many issues on which decision has not happened for over decades. Since 98 to today, hasn't the electronic transmission business, transaction business, trading business evolved? Shouldn't there be a change in the policy of WTO in terms of that their moratorium should continue? A moratorium in 98 and a moratorium today on electronics when the world has moved so much on the digital. It is that which I like to question. It's not to say that, we have to reverse the benefits of globalization. It is more to say, make globalization more transparent.
In that context, obviously, there's a whole set of issues regarding the proposed Indo-Pacific economic framework. And I very much want to hear your views on that. But just moving from your last comment, Minister, the US government, the Biden administration, I believe has some very strong aspirations in this electronic and digital flows for IPEF as well. So leaving aside the WTO agreement of 98, how do you see this playing out in IPEF? Will the US heed and hear more than the WTO did on this topic?
Well, before I answer this particular aspect of the IPEF, I would like to draw the attention that for IPEF, the moment it was discussed and it was put across, India was one of the first countries to readily come on board onto 3 of the 4 pillars. We were very happy to come on board saying this is going to help in getting together so many countries in the Indo-Pacific area, because this is very important. And together, in all probability, if my data is right, more than 40% of the global trading communities and the markets would be covered under this. So we are enthusiastic about IPEF. We would want to progress with it. On this issue of electronic transmission, we'll certainly have to sit and work with. I would want to take the example of the global taxation, which became a part of the G20, yet to be ratified by some. We were one of the earliest to agree with Secretary Yellen at that time, in 2022, I would think, on the global taxation for the digital marketing which happens. 1998 was the first through WTO. Now we are talking under the IPEF. But in between, just a few years ago, only 2 years ago, did we talk about the global taxation, where large marketing MNCs were doing business across the world. They were generating profit in one jurisdiction, but were registered in a different jurisdiction. Where would you tax them? All of us agreed that they're being taxed in in fact, they're not being taxed in both the places. Double taxation avoidance. It wasn't happening in both places. So as a result, the 2-pillar solution, which came up with the taxation framework, we had agreed to it. So as regards how we would handle electronic transmission under the IPEF, you can see that there is one step taken forward, and a big step at that, in the G20. So here too, if we sit together and all the minds are put together thinking about it, I'm sure solutions can emerge.
So since you have taken up in the broader context, this is a great opportunity to ask you more about your vision going forward for IPEF. The pillars that you mentioned that, as you say, India was one of the first to stand up and support, so far, to analysts like us at the Peterson Institute, have not yielded very much. What do you see as a practical agenda going forward for IPEF? Is there anything India would like to come out of this beyond just the association of like-minded countries?
Well, you're right. I would like to see a greater substantive discussion on all the three pillars in which we are, and of course the fourth pillar for all others as well who have come on board in the first pillar, which is trade, I think.
Right.
So yes, more needs to be done. More needs to be done substantially. There has to be greater involvement of all those who have subscribed to it to sit and talk about it. Sooner we see tangible results, greater the benefit for all of us, especially when the global churn is happening on trade, I would think.
Yes. So a common thread you mentioned earlier, again, I'm just checking my notes, I apologize, the phased manufacturing program and then the other efforts as well as your opening up to developing countries, and just the way that India is poised to starting to be even more important in global value chains. And then there's IPEF. And both of these, to be frank, are seen in Washington as ways of rerouting the global economy away from China. I guess the question is that going to be enough to sustain the shift in global value chains, to sustain the IPEF? Is the mutual interest in reducing the power of China enough to keep these economic arrangements going, or is there something else there?
That is not just going to be sufficient. You need more into it, because however much we would think that supply chains will have to be moved out of China, it may not be the case. China and others could be the possible realistic solution. So even as China is opening up back again after the zero tolerance and everything else, I would still think there would be a lot of investment interests and also manufacturing interests going back to China or restoring themselves in China. So it will be unrealistic to think everything is going to get out of China. But yet, the shock that had happened in terms of disruptions in supply chain justifies more than one location. And countries like India would be the best in terms of the skill sets that our Indians, particularly the youth, have, because today between 15 to 29 years of age, they constitute nearly 27% of our Indian population. So you have every reason to come there and invest, and also a captive domestic market as well. I'm sure there are other countries which are pitching in with the same kind of tone, Vietnam or Indonesia or countries like that. It just sends the very strong message which I would think the world didn't notice earlier or didn't want to choose earlier. And that is spreading your resource basket or supply chain is a far more prudent way of continuing in business, however much the cost complications make it difficult in other places and the cost benefit makes it possible to concentrate in one jurisdiction.
As we mentioned earlier, we're coming out of India's G20 leadership in which you played a key role. There are so many different organizations. What do you see as the successes of India's chairing the G20, given the fact that there's obviously a division in the group due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine? And what do you hope your successors in the next couple of years can take forward in the G20?
Well, I hope India hosting or India holding the presidency at this
Sorry, I said chair. I should have said presidency. I apologize.
So India being the president of G20 at this challenging time itself, for me, is a great opportunity for India to prove and to work towards bringing all countries together on substantive issues. There still can be one or two on which you're not able to get consensus. But there are pressing issues of the world which a forum like G20 will have to address. And I would think it is time that the members of G20 sit up and take these issues on board. And one of it is the debt distress which is going on among countries which we thought till recently were middle income countries. Not to speak of the low income countries, which are definitely facing critical challenges. But the rate of collapse of the middle income countries, one or two of them stand out as examples because of the distress, debt distress, needs to be addressed and addressed in time. And in this, the multilateral development institutions, I'm glad, are now speeding up and coming up with solutions for these countries to get back on their feet. But the delays till now, during the pandemic, it's excusable. But even before the pandemic, 3, 4, 5 years sometimes for countries to get resolution from IMF or be able to sit up and say we have some alternatives is not good enough. And I'm glad today the IMF and the World Bank are all looking at it with a lot more positive open-mindedness. So India's presidency, therefore, at this time to look at institutional reform, to make them 21st century ready, to make them ready for meeting situations such as pandemic. For instance, World Health Organization, not the discussion point for G20, but earlier, a high-level committee was appointed just to make sure that any future pandemic, God forbid, we shouldn't have one, but then any future pandemic does not have the same pressing issues as we had in 2020. Not enough resources, not quickly dispersing them, and so on. So the high-level committee came up with suggestions and formulations with which funds have to be raised, they have to be located, and located within the WHO, but at least be ready to address such issues, because by the time the vaccinations could reach the African nations, for instance, in many cases it didn't even reach. It was rather too late by the time it could reach. And there were countries which were willing to share, but there were many others who were not willing to share even vaccines. So these are issues which we as the G20 presidency are happy to be able to work together with countries and get them onto the center stage so that solutions can be arrived at. Similarly, there are other very pressing issues such as cryptocurrencies. We've seen so many collapses, such shocking developments in the crypto world. Even that requires the G20 to give its time. We are pressing with some kind of a proposal. The IMF is giving a paper, the FSB is giving a paper. Again, India presidency taking that on board and taking up the cause of a common framework with which all countries can deal with this matter. We are not expecting them to agree to it, but at least discuss it, IMF and FSB's papers. So there are so many different such agenda with which India's presidency will put forward our own proposal, but also carry forward some of those which, say, the Italian presidency had, Japanese presidency had, in terms of building smart urban infrastructure, quality urban infrastructure. So we are carrying forward some of the agenda of the earlier presidencies, setting our own issues on the table, and future presidencies will work together with them. But I'll finish this with this one last line. From the last presidency, Indonesia, ours now, and then Brazil and so on, you will have emerging market countries being the president of G20, at least in 3 consequent terms. And I hope this will bring more of the emerging market views and also the voice of the South onto the table of G20, which we hope we're able to bring on now.
If I could follow up on that, one place where, at least in my understanding, the Indian presidency has been key is on the debt issues you started with. I believe Sri Lanka's somewhat restructuring is in part thanks to India's leadership. In Washington, there is constant discussion of the idea that the US and China are very far apart on debt issues, that China doesn't have the same transparency or possibilities for restructuring that Paris Club debtors do. Should we expect any progress on this by the end of the spring meetings, that on the debt issues, whether through India's leadership or through the G20 or through the IMF? Do you have hope for some progress in this dispute?
Yes, I have hope for some movement forward, because not just the India presidency of the G20, but both the IMF and the World Bank themselves are also holding a global sovereign debt roundtable. An initial roundtable discussion happened in Bengaluru, where the first G20 finance ministers meeting took place in February this year. There will be one now as well. And this initiative, all stakeholders in the debt issue, sovereign creditors, also private creditors and multilateral institutions are all going to be present. And I would think, therefore, the G20 presidency addressing debt-related issues, the IMF and World Bank themselves holding the round table on the global sovereign debt, will all create enough discussion and the sharing of information that they, I think, even after the spring meeting and hopefully after that in every other meeting as well, this issue will be taken forward, and I hope to have some positive movements.
One issue, you've been very generous with your time, Minister, and I'm very aware that you'll have a next appointment. But let me try to get in another couple questions, if I may. One issue we haven't spoken about so far today is issues of climate and decarbonization. There again, there is very different voices, south and north, so to speak, as well as east and west. We're looking at a potential where Europe and the US may be putting so-called carbon border adjustment mechanisms on forms of tariffs or other barriers for exports from countries that are not meeting their vision of the targets. I think Brazil, for example, is much more in the crosshairs of this immediately than, say, India, but it's obviously something that affects emerging markets greatly. What do you want US and Europe to hear, if not heed, to use your phrase again, from the South in this regard? Or is this fair game that they can do this?
Well, I certainly have some things which I'd love them to hear.
Please. We'll try to amplify it.
Because India has come up with very ambitious, nationally determined goals. So the commitments which we have given in COP21 earlier and COP26 subsequently are all working together with those parameters which, let's say, everybody agreed in the UN FCCC. And so all of us will walk the path the way we have nationally determined commitments that has been given. And I'm happy to say that India somehow fulfilled its COP21 commitments given in Paris, largely out of its own funds. So funding is there, but not available. Committed, but not actually dispersed yet. So the 100 billion that we've been talking about has not happened at all. So that could be something which many countries would want to speak, and I'll put that on my list. But however, there are these real-time worries as to what is the per capita emission that we're talking about, which actually is hurting all of us. Is per capita emission going in favor of XYZ countries, or is it going against some other country? isn't there some kind of an element of justice which is inbuilt when you're talking about per capita emission? And also this morning when we were talking about things, there was this discussion about stock and flow of emissions. So there are even today very learned view on what exactly is emission and how much is happening from where. And is it got to be only today's, or is it got to be from the time Industrial Revolution 1.0 happened? So there are still certain, what you call, pain points which have to be addressed. Also worrying for me, even as we plan our nationally determined commitments to be fulfilled, is the way in which an all-encompassing, but doesn't appear so much in front of you, instruments through which, tools through which countries are going to be questioned or bound by certain expectations, such as when you're funding development projects. For countries like India, I can't speak for many others, but I'll speak for my own, where we are proving repeatedly that we are complying with the expectations and the commitments given by us. If funding for developmental activities come with inbuilt conditions, saying unless you use this element of, let us say, steel, or this element of cement, or you get this particular machine to do it for you, this fund will not be able to help your developmental goals. Now, this is going to be the potential friction point, because the reverse of it, if you notice, and I'm placing it completely, if you may allow me to say this, brazenly. I'm putting my case forward about how my developmental funding is going to be now coming and picking on items, or cherry picking, saying I'll fund this, but I'll not fund that, as opposed to the way in which the border adjustment tariff that you're talking about, which Europe is probably coming up with. I take the example of steel. Any non-green steel coming into Europe is going to be put on with, or burdened with, a higher customs duty to make up for the fact that it is not a green steel, it is a dirty steel, but yet we'll buy the dirty steel if you pay more. And why do we do that? Because we have dirty steel, which has now got to become clean steel, but for the cost, I need this money which is coming from the border adjustment tax. I'm sorry to speak like an activist, but that's how it looks. So my non-green steel is okay for you as long as I'm paying extra. That extra is not coming for me to convert my dirty steel into green steel, good steel, whereas I'm being given the comfort of you may export to me, I'll buy your dirty steel provided you pay me more. And what will I do with that money? I'll convert my green steel to, my dirty steel to green steel, and post that the world will come up with a situation of saying no non-green steel can be traded, sorry, and the only green steel will be available you know where. So that worries me. I wish that money is available for all of us who are producing steel, and say, like, you also make your steel greener now and I'll do mine, and then afterwards we'll see who's cost effective and therefore trade on that. Is it fair practice, therefore? And therefore, if I were to replicate it, are we doing what Mahatma Gandhi said once? I'm blind in one eye, but I would punish the other, and therefore all of us will become blind. Is that the solution we are giving for trading and in the name of green? So there are worries about how the green issues are going to be spoken about, carried forward, and to make the world greener, sometimes I'm not sure solutions are working in favor of all.
We generally are at least I personally, I won't speak for the Institute, are generally in favor of solutions that are based on industry or action behavior rather than location. So it's very good to hear your perspective. Another place, though, where perceptions are very different in Europe, if not the US, from India, is on politics. There is widespread reporting in the Western press about MPs from the opposition party losing status, about Muslim minorities in India being subjected to violence. I'm not going to ask you to deny or comment or rebut. What I would ask is, are these perceptions affecting in any way your sense of investment in India or capital flows, or has this not been an issue?
I would think the answer for that lies with those investors who are coming to India, and they've been coming. And as somebody who's interested in receiving investments, I would only say, come have a look at what's happening in India, rather than listen to perceptions being built by people who have not even visited on the ground and who produce reports. Again, emerging markets do carry this burden of, you're the emerging market, you have every business to ask us for help, or every business to speak about every issue on which you need to play a constructive role, but yet the prescriptions are ours. I would want to ask if that's not to say, or not to even imply that I accept the perception that you're referring to. India has the second largest Muslim population in the world. And that population is only growing in numbers. If there is a perception, or if there's in reality, their lives are difficult or made difficult with the support of the state, which is what is implied in most of these write-ups, I would ask, will this happen in India, in the sense, will the Muslim population be growing than what it was in 1947? As opposed to, let us say, I take the name of the country and therefore the contrast can be sharper, as opposed to Pakistan, which was formed at the same time. India was divided into two, Pakistan. Pakistan declared itself an Islamic country, but however said, minorities will be protected. Every minority has been dwindling in its number, or if I may use the word which is harsher, decimated in Pakistan. Even some of the Muslim sects have also been decimated. Violence prevails against Muhajirs, Shia, and every other group you can name, which is not accepted by the mainstream, I don't know, Sunnis probably. Whereas in India, you would find every strand of Muslim doing their business, their children getting educated, fellowships are being given by the government, and I would want to see where exactly is that one state where. And again, law and order is a very state subject. It's not the government of India's subject. Each province has its elected government. They take care of the law and order in those states. So across the board in India, if violence is happening to make Muslims get affected, itself is a fallacy as a statement. It cannot be so. Each province and its police are different. They are run by the elected governments in those provinces. So that itself tells you how these reports have no clue of the law and order systems in India. To say it's all the blame of government of India, I would want to say, then tell me, between 2014 and today, has the population dwindled? Has the deaths been disproportionately high in any one particular community? So I would rather invite these people who write these reports to come to India. I'll host them. I'll host them. Let them come and let them travel alone India and prove their point.
I am certain there are some journalists who will hear this broadcast, and they may even take you up on that.
I'll welcome.
No, I understand. You made a sincere offer. I understand that. So let me close on a very narrow finance minister question, since you have to go and you've been very generous with your time and your thoughts. 5 years from now, let's assume that you are still the minister 5 years from now. What will be the benchmarks of your success? What do you hope in terms of some growth numbers or budget numbers or employment numbers or poverty numbers, just broadly speaking? What would you hope 5 more years would bring India?
The first thing is, of course, we are reaching near saturation in providing the basic facilities in India. Earlier, the discussions would be on poverty alleviation. Have we removed this many number of people from out of poverty and lifted them out? Today, the approach of the government is to empower the poor people with at least the basic amenities, and that is give them some good house to live in, which is made of concrete and not this thatched roof, with toilets in them, with drinking water reaching them through pipes, electricity, and a good road, not just to the village, but also to the streets in the village, and then connect them to the nearest highway, connect them with good transport facility, and so on. So saturation, financial inclusion, so that each member of the household has a bank account, and they get every such benefit which has to reach them, but directly into their bank account rather than through a middle agency. So in each one of these, we are reaching saturation, which means if there are 100 people today who are eligible to get them, they would get. We are nearer 98, 99. And of course, newer people can get added as the population grows. We'll keep attending to them, but saturation should be attended. So that is one of the goals which we'll. Second, we are now focusing very much on skilling people, each according to their level. So skilling centers are now spread all over the country. The gradation of the skilling vary according to individuals, and businesses and private sector entrepreneurs are also tied into it, so that there is a link between the kind of training that businesses want and actually those who are getting the training, so that immediately they can get recruited. So there will be a lot of skilling emphasis. India's digitization program will be going at full throttle, and it will cover most aspects of our lives. Today it covers health, education, and also financial transactions. We expect it to move on to other areas as well, so that there's greater ease of living. And transparency, economy gets even more formal, and therefore with that, you find the economy has its full strength coming on board, rather than having a second layer which remains in the gray area.
Terrific. Please join me in thanking Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman, India's Minister of Finance and Corporate Affairs. Thank you, Minister, for joining us at the Peterson Institute.
You're welcome.
This meeting is adjourned. We will welcome many of you, we hope, either online or in person, to our upcoming Macro Week, which includes a number of presentations from other G7 and G20 policymakers. Thank you very much. Yes, of course. Thank you so much, madam. Very nice.